Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. So just as a little aside, I have some sort of a cold or something today. So if I sound a little bit scratchy and otherwise potentially look a little under the weather, that's because I am. But I am so excited to be here that I didn't want to cancel this wonderful presentation. And I've known Iris now for, my goodness, a long time, right, Iris? So this is very exciting to be doing this. And also, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or interrupt, because I think it's much more engaging when we can have a conversation rather than me just, sort of throwing a bunch of slides at you and not having the ability to ask questions. And last but not least, there's no stupid question when it comes to AI. I would say it's a very, very complicated topic. I use the joke that AI is like teenage sex. Everyone says they're doing it, but nobody really knows what it is. So if you feel like you have a stupid question, don't be shy. I'm sure all of your peers are also. Just remember back to when you were a teenager and you had questions about sex and nobody wanted to ask them. That's probably how you're going to feel. All right, cool. So without any further ado, all of the things in my bio are true. I used to be an academic scientist, and then I went to HBS to commercialize my science, and that's where I saw recruiting firsthand, and that's how I came up with the idea for pymetrics, just realizing that really what was missing was not to better help recruiters understand somebody's CV, but really to help them understand a person's soft skills, so their cognitive, social, and emotional aptitudes. And that's what pymetrics measures. So this is less about pymetrics and more about just how we can use AI to improve the all talent processes. So I won't get into what pymetrics does specifically, just to say that we don't look at a person's resume, we look at cognitive, social, and emotional aptitudes in order to understand somebody better. And we do that in a cognitive science behavioral way, which means that we put them through a series of activities that have been validated over the last couple of decades by cognitive scientists. And we've done the additional work to then link things like attention or decision-making or risk tolerance to a whole host of occupations that people could be employed to. That's the sort of innovation that pymetrics did. But really what we're here to talk about is bias. So I think that, when we think about whether it's human decision-making or algorithmic decision-making, what people are most concerned about is bias. And the reason they're most concerned about it is because it's ever present. And so as a cognitive scientist, we spend a lot of time studying the brain. And I think that it's fair to say that Danny Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, really outlined a good way to think about the human brain and human decision-making, which is the brain is really hardwired to have two thinking systems. He outlined them as system one, which is fast thinking, immediate, instinctive, and based on patterns, and system two, which is slow thinking or reflective, methodical, and nuanced. The reason this matters for anything talent related is that fast thinking is part of our more instinctive brain. And so therefore it's far more likely to be prevalent when we are doing things rapidly. So it's speedy pattern recognition. And it's completely evolutionarily adaptive, which is why it's still present. So if you see a tiger, you don't want system two to kick in and spend 30 minutes wondering how you should respond to a tiger. You want the fast system to kick in and say, tiger, danger, run. That's what the fast thinking system is for. However, you can imagine that those fast associations can be easily hijacked in situations where we don't want them to be present. And I would argue that that's where that's where the problem of fast thinking comes into talent decisions, because most recruiters look at a resume for 6 seconds, and you can imagine that it's not their slow thinking system that's helping them make those decisions at the moment. And so this is just to say that fast thinking really is what underpins a lot of unconscious bias in hiring. And the problem is that system one doesn't learn from, reading a paper or some other way of learning. It learns by what I call osmosis. So if you've primarily seen men or Caucasians in a particular position, field of employment, you have learned by osmosis. Your system one thinking has learned by osmosis that men are more likely to be CEOs and that Caucasians are more likely to be in finance than other ethnicities. And therefore, it's very hard to unlearn that. And that's why I think we all have to accept the fact that we are all biased, whether we like it or not. And the more we can accept that and not judge ourselves for it, but just be real about the fact that it exists, I think, the better position we will be to come up with solutions. So what does this lead to in recruiting? It leads to the fact that, so again, I'll just back up for 1 second. So people always say like, well, what is bias? How do you define bias and so on? In the world of employment, there's a very sort of standard definition of bias. It's called the 4/5 rule, and I'll break it down for you. So basically what the 4/5 rule means is that if you are selecting people for, from a resume pile into an interview pile or some other step of the talent employment process, it could be promotion, it could be a whole bunch of different things. If you have 100 candidates of one group and 100 candidates of another group, and you select 10 from group A, you should select no fewer than 8 from group B. That's what the 4/5 rule means. It means the selection ratio of different groups should have a ratio of no less than 0.8. Ideally, it should be as close to 1 as possible, but it should absolutely not go below 0.8. And if it does go below 0.8, it's called disparate impact. Now, I won't bore you with all the legal definitions and whatnot, but essentially think of anything, a selection ratio that falls under 0.8 as legally defined as disparate impact. And I think lay people would see this as a definition of bias, right? Because we all understand that no system is perfect and that a 1-to-1 ratio might not be always achievable because of large numbers and other things like that. But we want to try to make our selection as equitable as possible. And so we have this sort of, error rate around 1, which is legally defined as 0.8. Now, the problem is that 2 of the most commonly used hiring screens in the US don't even come close to meeting the 0.8 threshold. One is not human bias. One is what we are familiar with as cognitive testing. And this sort of falls into what you would think of traditionally as cognitive testing. And here I'm showing you the selection ratios of Caucasians versus African Americans. And you can see that cognitive testing is extremely biased and that only 3 African American candidates pass for every 10 Caucasians. And it's not much better for people of Hispanic descent. But because we were talking primarily about human decision making and why we think artificial intelligence or any kind of automated process can do better, let's look to how does human resume review do. So it's not as bad as cognitive testing, but a meta-analysis done a few years ago that was published in PNAS that looked at essentially 30 years worth of what are called callback studies. So a callback study is, researchers submit resumes and they see how many people are called back for an interview. And the way they run these callback studies is they submit the exact same resume, or in certain cases, a very close proxy of the resume, but essentially the credentials are intended to be identical, and they just change the name. And what they found is that changing the name from John Williams, a Caucasian sounding name, to Jamal meant that for every 10 Johns that were given an interview, only 7 Jamals were. And for a Hispanic sounding name like Juan, it wasn't much better. It was right at 0.8. So this chart basically should show that, unfortunately, even in present day, because this meta-analysis went, for the last, basically the latest data in this meta-analysis was only a few years old. Even to present day, we're really not doing any better in terms of undermining or undercutting the bias that's present in all human decision making. And this is why whenever I hear people say, oh, but artificial intelligence or automation is more scalable, that's actually not true. There's nothing more scalable than the fact that every brain has system 1 thinking in it. And yes, every brain is independent, but it's a little bit like a school of fish. They're all independent, but they all act in the same way. And every brain shows, unfortunately, this type of bias. So it's actually, I think, a false statement to say that automation is more scalable than human bias, because human bias is present in all of us. So this hopefully has shown you that we're biased, and unfortunately, system 1 thinking is going to hijack our best intentions to remove that bias. And this meta-analysis also showed that during this time that unconscious bias persisted, system 2 thinking, or our attitudes towards diversity, were improving, right? So it wasn't that, our system 2 thinking was saying, oh no, we shouldn't have more equality in society. No, that system was absolutely on board. But again, it's that system 1 thinking that's really undermining all of that. So what can we do? As you know, Iris and others, you know, have pointed out, and meta-analyses of the same type that were done in the audit studies have shown, unconscious bias training really doesn't have much evidence to support the fact that it's effective. So basically what the research has shown, at least the research that I'm most familiar with dating back to a few years, is that unconscious bias training doesn't actually change behavior, and unfortunately can sometimes give people a sense of false confidence that they are actually changing behavior or combating prejudice, making people less likely to actually do stuff that works. And I think that's important to note because a lot of people want to implement unconscious bias training. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that, but what I always say is that it's great as an awareness raiser, but it's not actually going to really change your behavior. And I always equate this to, you know, it's a little bit like saying, I want to look like Jennifer Lopez, but I'm going to go to the gym for 4 hours one time in my life and think that, you know, I'm going to end up looking like her. No, that's not true. She goes to the gym, I don't even know, probably daily for several hours. So if we did unconscious bias training daily for hours, then maybe it would work. But it's like any other behavioral intervention. It would need to really be implemented in that way for it to be effective. And that's not, generally speaking, how most people are implementing it. So again, just to show that there is a tremendous amount of bias still, and unconscious bias training doesn't work. So what does work? And again, Iris coordinated amongst a group of academics to write this paper called What Works. It was published by UMass in the spring of 2020. And they really showed, and it's a great paper linked here in the slides. I'm sure Iris can also provide you with, you know, the PDF. Basically, we have things that do work, right? And I'm going to just sort of highlight them and then go into unbiased technology, which is really what I know the most about in the chapter that we wrote. Having metrics and goals is super critical. Transparency and accountability are all really important. However, unbiased technology really can be a hugely impactful and effective tool. And that's really what systems like pymetrics are designed to do, is to provide an unbiased layer that can really help in this regard. Now, usually when I say this, skeptics will say, well, how do you even know that it's unbiased? Well, first they'll say, what do you mean by unbiased? Isn't everything biased? And then I will refer them back to the conversation around the 4/5 rule and essentially say, look, at the end of the day, we're trying for equality, which is a 1-to-1 selection ratio, but there's this error bar that is allowed legally to occur. So that's sort of the first conversation that happens. And then what they say is like, well, how do you know? Like, it sounds great, but how do you know? And so that's what the rest of this presentation is going to be about, is how can we ensure, and again, this is what we do at Pymetrics, but again, this can be done anywhere. And there are other systems out there that have also deployed some of these methodologies to ensure that our technology is unbiased. And so that's what I'm going to get into in the rest of the presentation. So I just want to pause here and see if there are any questions before I move on. No questions? Okay. Don't be shy. Okay, so the first thing that we have done at Pymetrics since we began implementing algorithms is proactive debiasing and auditing. Again, you may have heard some of these terms thrown around. There are different ways to achieve these outcomes. There's also a lot of what I would call ethics washing in the field. So I would just say buyer beware. Everything that says they're debiased or audited doesn't necessarily mean that's true. But I can tell you what we did, and I can also tell you kind of like some of the things that we've done to validate that this is true. So basically what we do whenever we build a model, and this is basically implemented in our software pipe now, so it's not something that we have to turn on or off, it's just automatically on whenever we build an algorithm, is we start with all of the measures that we have, and then we build the algorithm. And then what we do is we use this tool that we built called Audit AI to check the model for disparate impact. And so again, it's against that 0.8 threshold. Some clients will actually at this point, we're using a 0.85 threshold, and some clients actually ask us to use a 0.9 threshold, right? So they want that error bar to be tighter, and we're completely fine with that. So we will do that, and we'll check the model for bias. And then it's an iterative process, essentially. And it's an iterative process that continues to, and again, when we say we build a model, it's actually hundreds of models that we are building, and we're essentially, sort of iteratively removing things that are causing bias and then testing again, causing bias and testing again. And we're assessing this on what we call an out of sample, with an out of sample training set. So what we do is we have at this point, we've had close to 4 million people go through pymetrics, which is actually one of the largest data sets of soft skills out there, which is, we're very proud. And of that, we have a subsection of that database that has given us gender and ethnic information. So we use that out of sample training set or testing set rather to evaluate whether it holds up in terms of being unbiased, right? So we have this initial process that we use, but then we have this much larger set that we then tested on. And again, that's done in an iterative way. So that's how we can get around essentially, or sorry, not get around. That's how we can ensure that our models are built sort of with the highest of debiasing or standards that are out there, is because we're building hundreds of models and iteratively testing until we find a model that is both predictive, meaning it actually can separate people who are performing well in the job from a baseline, but also in a fashion that is unbiased. Now, I will stop here and say that the reason we can do this and other solutions are more challenged is because the measures that we start with are largely equally distributed. So what I mean by that is the soft skill measures that we selected to put into the system, we tested them for gender and ethnic bias, and all but 2 have no gender bias, and all but I think it's like 10% or 15% have no ethnic bias. Now, ethnic bias is harder because there's just more subgroups. So, but to have a data set where the vast majority of things that you are measuring are not proxy variables for gender and race is one of the most critical features of pymetrics. And that is why we can actually build models that are predictive and unbiased. Because think about it, if we're training on a sample that is highly Caucasian or highly male, which won't surprise you to know that that is often the case, and we have little diversity in the sample. Now, we try to get as much diverse populations in the sample as possible, but sometimes it's just not possible. But the fact that our measures are equally distributed is what allows us to be able to build a model that is both predictive and unbiased. Because otherwise, what ends up happening is there's a very significant trade-off. If your models are if your data is full of proxy variables, you can either be predictive or you can be unbiased, but it's hard to be both. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind. Any questions before I go on to the next slide? I can't see the little chat window. So if there's a question.
Questions? I'm going to call on a few people. So I saw some hands up, but now I'm going to sum out. Mike and then Arbor.
Thank you, Dr. Polli.
Yeah, sure.
Can you understand, or should I?
Yes. No, I can hear. Yep.
My voice is audible?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So, Dr. Polli, do you think that all the biases are undesirable? I'm taking a step back from the AI, from the platform, and I'm just wondering if all the biases are undesirable. And here I would draw analogy to that of friction on a surface. That while it's considered to be evil, but it's considered to be a necessary evil. So, do you think biases also fall in that category or not? Thank you.
So what I would say is the biases, the way I have defined them, which is gender and ethnic disparate impact, yes, I would say is undesirable. Other people might have other biases that they put, like sometimes people call bias things that I wouldn't call bias. Like, for example, people are like, well, aren't you biased towards people that can perform the job well? Okay, yes, but that's not a bias. That's a job-related attribute that is important. But I do think that gender and ethnic disparate impact is undesirable. Yes.
I hope you can hear me too. Thank you so much for being here.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a bit more about the data you are using? Because I heard you talking about soft skill data, and I mean, certain soft skills by nature are just more prone, the way we are raised, right? So some women might be better at communication, some men might be better at negotiation, for example. So, I mean, what kind of data are you using? What does the data set look like? And how do you account for the kind of inherent bias that our generation still has because of the way we are socialized? Not sure if I'm making sense here, but
yeah, absolutely. And so again, I think that soft skills can be defined in many ways, and more traditional soft skill evaluation systems absolutely have bias in them, and we'll get to that in the later part of the presentation. But cognitive science, for a variety of different reasons, measures things that are sort of more fundamental and less socially learned. I guess that would be the best way to describe it. So the more sort of fundamental you can be, I think, the more we realize people are the same, people are equal. And the more we sort of rely on things that have been conditioned by society, whether it's a resume or some of these other things, I think that that's where sort of gender and ethnic proxies start to creep in. I don't have a ton of slides on what we measure, but I'm happy to send them along to Iris after this presentation, mostly because I wanted to focus on how you can be biased and what you should be doing. But think of it in terms of like, we measure fundamental things like attention or decision making or risk tolerance or generosity. And again, the way that we measure them, and this is why I'm putting up the slide, the way that we measure them through behavior, not self-report, actually just yields very unbiased data. And I mean, it just is what it is. Like that was part of the beauty of the system, is that we knew that these data were going to be far less biased than a lot of other soft skill systems out there.
Thank you. Arba.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering, do you have an example, like a practical example of some sort of biases that you spotted and you were somehow then later able to move from your system?
Wait, sorry, I don't think I fully heard the question. Do you mind just
I can totally
ask
repeat
a
the
bit louder?
question. The question was, could you give an example of one of those variables where you spotted bias and that you then remove the
Oh,
bias?
sure.
Right?
So yeah. So again, so let's just take gender. So when we look at all of the variables and we measure over 100, there are only 2 that just, if you look at the population level, have bias. However, that's looking at millions of people. What you can find in much, much smaller samples is you can have one of those variables that at the population level shows no bias, but on a much smaller sample shows bias. It's called the Simpsons Paradox. It just basically means when you're sampling a small sample, you might end up having bias that doesn't exist at the population level. Does that make sense? So the vast majority of our unbiased variables at some point or another will show up as causing bias. It just depends on the particular subsample that you've selected. Does that make sense? So there's nothing wrong with that measure in and of itself. It's just that in a small sample, like when we build models, we're only using, hundreds, maybe 1,000 people, and in a, as opposed to the much broader set that we have. And so you can always, just through for mathematical reasons, when it's that small sample, you could always find a variable that could be causing bias in that particular instance. Is that helpful?
Thank you.
And Frida, because you and I have talked about that before, maybe I can add a little bit on that. Let's take risk tolerance, something that Frida alluded to beforehand, where a number of researchers have found small, but have found persistent gender differences in willingness to take risk. Now, as Frida said, there's one big concern about what researchers, including myself, have done in the past, and that is that our samples often have been very small, in that we have used behavioral measures, but in fact, the sample size wasn't millions of people, thousands of people, but was relatively small. And so one question is, does this go away if we literally measure like millions of people, like a very, very big sample, is kind of one question. And then I think a second thing, Frida, I think I can say that here, right? You're also thinking about the weights that you assign to these different measures, right? So potentially you could assign a smaller weight to something that the client might say, risk taking is really important. I need that. You please keep that variable. That's important for the job, whatever.
Yep.
I'm picking a risk, by the way, Frida.
Sure.
I don't know whether that was one of the 2, but just as an example.
It is actually, yeah.
Your tool, right? You can play with that. You can say, well, if you really want it, there's a bit of an issue here. There are gender differences.
Yep.
But we could assign less weight to that variable,
Yep.
maybe assign more weight to memory or, other things that Mike asked about before.
Yep.
Patience, things like that.
Yeah, and again,
Frida?
yeah, Iris, I think that's absolutely right. And again, I'm just going to bring it back to the fact that, the way we measure risk is in a behavior-based way, using a, computer simulation, right? As opposed, which again has linkages to real world behavior. It's not just a complete lab artifact, right? But you can imagine, people have known for a long time that if you measure people's behavior, it tends to produce less biased outcomes than if you ask them to engage in sort of paper and pencil self-report and other tests. There's a whole host of theories, which I won't get into right now. But I think that is also partly why, potentially we see, because risk isn't one of those ones where we see differences between men and women, although yes, fully familiar with the studies that have shown that. So I think it's an interesting paradox. Why is that? You know, not 100% clear, but I think I think to your point, it could be a sample size issue. It could be other things. It could be how we're measuring it. It could be the definition and so on and so forth. But I think the thing that I want to leave you with is that it's a good thing, right? It's a great thing, actually, because the more unbiased measures we can find, yes, they sound counterintuitive because people are like, well, what do you mean? That doesn't exist, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, look, I've heard them all. I've heard all of this, but the fact is our data set shows that. So it's true. It's a real thing. And by the way, it does link to behavior on a job, right? So it's not like we're just measuring some random thing that doesn't matter. So I understand that it's a bit mind-blowing. It sure would be mind-blowing for me if I hadn't been doing this work for a long time, but it is a real thing. And you know, I think that what this presentation hopefully will inspire people to do is look for other measures that don't show bias, right? Because I think for too long as a society, we've become complacent. We've said, well, you know, it's impossible to find that. Men and women are different. People of different ethnicities are different. We actually haven't focused on finding things that are the same. And I think that's what we really need to do, is spend more time focusing on things that we can find in equal measure among different groups of people. Let me just get through a few more slides and then happy to take some other questions. These are
That sounds great.
all great
Perfect.
questions. And,
Frida,
you know,
can I just quickly go to Siri, but do we
Yeah.
have anyone online
Oh,
that
sure.
chimed in with the question? No, we're okay. We can wait. I just want to make sure we're not biased against people who are
Yeah.
not in the room, but I think we're okay. And then I know Mariana and Dharmendra had their hands up.
Perfect.
So we'll
So
visit those questions later.
yeah, perfect. So this is just a visualization of what we do in that previous slide when I was explaining that, you know, we build hundreds of models and essentially we're selecting from this top, you know, in true consultant form in the top right-hand quadrant, the green circles, the ones that meet both basically performance standards, meaning that they predict performance, as well as accuracy standards. And by the way, this is something that we'll get into in a later slides, but essentially the laws that govern what one should be doing if using an automated process actually say that you should be looking for the least biased alternative. Actually, let me just flip to that slide. So basically there's sort of three things that guide what are called uniform guidelines for employment selection procedures. It's a mouthful, but basically when you're using something that is akin to a test or an automated procedure, you really should be doing these three things. You should try to avoid disparate impact. If disparate impact is found, you should show evidence of job relatedness. And then last but not least, you should document the search for the least biased alternative. This isn't only in employment, this is in credit, this is in housing, this is anywhere else where this idea of disparate impact or sort of this error bar around equality exists. The idea is basically that you should always be looking for the least biased, most predictive solution out there, because for obvious reasons. So again, this is just saying that I think one of the cool parts of machine learning is that you can actually automate this, right? Prior to machine learning, this was a very difficult task and it would take months and, you know, yada, yada. For us now we can do this and it's automated as part of the process. And so what's exciting about this, and again, there are other companies that do this too. What's exciting is that you can automate the search for the least biased alternative into your process. And so really what that leads to is when you use, we call it automated AI, but, you know, just a little thing we call it. When you use machine learning that's been put through this process, you essentially see that we are close to that 1-to-1 threshold. We're not quite there yet, but we're close. And I think that's the real aha here, is that when you put models through this sort of rigorous testing process, you can, and we're publishing on this, actually, I've been pushing my amazing research and policy person that actually was an HKS graduate to hit send on the publication today. But these results are going to be out, and it's, you know, these results were collected over about 500,000 folks that went through the platform in a time box period, and we'll continue to publish on those results. But essentially what you can see is that we really are able to eliminate disparate impact. And it's something that, you know, we would encourage others to start using these methods and also be able to achieve these outcomes. One thing that we did prior to publishing the results, which again, as I mentioned, have yet to go out, is we actually engaged with a academic group at Northeastern, Krista Wilson and Alan Mislove, to basically audit our platform. So this was during the time that we were still in the throes of data collection and wanted to have And also just felt like an independent audit of our platform would actually be a valuable addition. And so what they did is they came in and they did, they basically were able to publish whatever they found. We didn't have any sort of, rights in terms of, like sort of guiding the publication. They had full access to the code base, they had full access to the data, and they actually tried to break our system. They actually tried to have our system produce a model with disparate impact that we would then deploy, and they found essentially that it was not possible. And so this is publicly available as well, and I think I shared it with you, Iris, but you're happy to go ahead and read it. And I think this was, by the time it was done, I think it was a really valuable learning process for us, and I think it has been sort of viewed as a gold standard audit. I'm not suggesting every platform has to do this, and I think people have pushed back saying a whole bunch of different things. And then others have said, hey, it didn't go far enough. You didn't look at intersectionality. You didn't look at disabilities and so on and so forth. So not claiming that it's the be all and end all of all audits, but I think it was a good step in the right direction and really shows that I think, you can put these tests to more scrutiny, these systems to more scrutiny. Now that having been said, this isn't necessary. Like I think and we'll get into this in a minute, but if you had public reporting, which we'll talk about in a minute, on how well does your system perform, an audit or a third-party audit isn't really that necessary, so long as you can be ensured that all platforms are reporting on disparate impact in a standardized way. So I see a bunch of questions in the chat. Happy to pause there before I go on to real-time monitoring. Any questions, or do you want me to keep going?
Thank you, Frida. Hi, it's Siri here. There was a request in the chat to go back to slide 21, please, just on the disparate impact, that graphic. Thank you. And on that note, what are the markers or causes of bias that are used in the debiasing selection? Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, sure. So basically, bias is actually, let me just go on to the next slide, which is our real-time monitoring system. And it might help you understand kind of like how we test for bias and how we remove it basically. So basically every model that we build, we're shooting for a 1-to-1 selection ratio, right? That's sort of equality, perfect equality. We test for any model so basically any model that falls below 0.8 or in some case, 0.85 now, or in some cases 0.9 is the threshold, we won't release. So this is what we're testing. We're ensuring we're doing every single possible selection comparison. So men versus women, black versus white, white versus Hispanic, Hispanic versus black, and so on. So I think it's like 16 different comparisons that we're doing. If any of them fall into the disparate impact threshold, which currently is defined as 0.8 or below. And again, it's a guidance. It's not a hard and fast set in stone, but it's a guidance. If any of those comparisons would yield disparate impact, meaning they fall below 0.8, we would then not start the process again, but we would select a model that didn't fall below 0.8, but still was accurate and predictive. That is in alignment with the Uniform Guidelines for Employment Selection Procedures, which first and foremost, they say you should avoid disparate impact. And that's how we're testing for it. And that's how it's defined, kind of in the legal literature. Is that helpful? Did I answer your question or not really?
I think so. Let's keep going. Thank you, Frida.
Sure, no worries. Any other questions?
Mariana, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I had one, but from before what we were talking, and you explained how I'm going back to the beginning of thinking fast and thinking slow, and you talked about how thinking fast, trying to unbiased thinking fast does not work.
That's correct.
But thinking slow, can you unbiased thinking slow? And here I am from an educational perspective. Do you believe that through education is possible to influence the thinking slow system of our brain?
Yes, I think it's possible, but I think in the processes that we work with in employment, I think it's most of the time this fast thinking system is what's at work. So I think the problem isn't that, again, I'm not an expert in unbiasing system too, I think it's probably possible. I think the problem is you have less control over that. So the whole point of this presentation is that one of the ways you can implement system 2 thinking is actually through processes and technology. Does that make sense? Sorry if that link wasn't clear. But instead of relying on human thinking, you can say my system 2 tells me I want to be unbiased. I know my system 1 doesn't allow me to achieve that. What else will allow me to achieve that? Okay, metrics and goals. Okay, transparency. Oh, accountability, and unbiased technology. So in improving all of these things, we're enabling that slow thinking system, because our slow thinking system wants to be equitable, wants to be fair. And so these are the types of, that's why this presentation is called Changing Systems, Not Minds, because I think it's far more effective to put processes and systems in place than it is to hope and pray that the human brain is less fallible than it was previously. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
Thank you. Dharma.
So, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question was in continuation what my colleague has asked. Is regarding one of the basic critique of AI, or what perpetuates bias, is the availability of diverse data sets and the use of proxies. So, and you say you have been able to use direct variables and not proxies. So how you've been able to source this data, that diverse data, and in general, extending from there, what are the incentives for an AI developer to source more diverse data set? Because usually the idea is to plug into the client data and provide a solution. So what incentives are there for them to provide diverse data set here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a great question. I actually think that, and I'm actually writing a paper on this with another CEO in the AI space, where they're doing a lot of work in credit. There are a lot more diverse data sets out there than you might think. It's just that they're not historically would have been used, right? And so in our case, it's, behavioral measures of soft skills. In the case of the work that they've been doing, it's instead of looking at sort of the things that FICO would normally pull, it's pulling a lot of, non-traditional data. So these data sets do exist. They really do. And I think that that's what I'm encouraging people to sort of understand, is that historically we've been very myopic in our view of what data can and cannot be used. And then I think that, whenever you start using new types of data, then people will start to, get up in arms because, oh, well, my goodness, this could be worse and all the rest of it. So, and I'm not saying they're incorrect. I mean, I think there are data sets that could be worse. So again, it's back to this idea that we should just be testing. Technology builders should always, always, always be testing all aspects of their data. And you should start with testing your measures. I mean, that's just a basic thing. And I think most people know this. Well, I shouldn't say most. Many people understand that you should really be testing for proxy variables in your data to begin with, even before you go into this process. And I think the more we can do that, I think, the more successful we'll be. Let me just present to you a little bit about the real-time bias monitoring system, because I think this is something that we're particularly excited about. The reason I want to present this to you is because I think a lot of people, again, sort of believe that it's hard to know whether a system is biased. And I think people feel very powerless to understand whether systems are biased or not. But that's actually not true. The biggest problem with testing to see whether a system is biased in real time is the legal challenges that you would bring upon yourself if you were measuring something like disparate impact where it's actionable, right? Meaning if I was testing my system in real time, not pre-deployment, but in real time for disparate impact, if I ever found that it was, below that 0.8 threshold, which can happen just from sample size, right? So this is what this graph is showing, is that when you're running a model and let's say you only have 250 people that have been through it, the likelihood that a perfectly equitable model, meaning a model that selects people on a 1-to-1 ratio, shows up as below this 0.8 threshold is actually very high, just because of small sample size and probability. It's really only once you start getting into the thousands of candidates or people that have gone through the model that you start to get robust and accurate estimates of that data. So, and again, this is a little bit like prostate cancer. Like if you screen for prostate cancer too often, you can actually find things that are prostate cancer and then take action that would be dangerous. So here we wanted to develop a real-time system that could monitor or sort of flag a model that might, even though in pre-deployment it was acting just fine, maybe in post-deployment it's not. And so it's the one thing we had to be careful of is not flagging something prematurely, and then also not doing it in a way that would trigger a legal responsibility. So this slide is to say that, you want to do it basically, while data collection is ongoing, but you don't want to have it be something that is very susceptible to sample size. And you also don't want to have something that triggers sort of legal responsibility. So what we came up with is basically a Bayesian methodology, which essentially allows us to test a hypothesis that the model is biased or unbiased. And so we're not measuring p-values, but we're measuring the likelihood that a model will eventually result in disparate impact, which is really cool. I have to tell you, like when our team kind of brought this to me, I was incredibly excited. And again, this isn't something that if it triggers, a result where basically, yes, this model, could result in bias, it's not the same as finding disparate impact, so you don't have any legal reporting liabilities. But what it does show you is that, you might have a model in production that is problematic. Now, again, this really doesn't happen very often for us at all. And for clients that are super concerned and maybe have a very non-diverse data set, we'll actually run the model in the background for, a number of years actually before we actually deploy it, to ensure that they're just collecting all that data and not acting on it in a way that could create disparate impact. But I think it's really exciting, and I wanted to bring this to this group because people often think it's impossible to test these systems. And Iris and I were having this conversation. I said, no, it actually is possible. And I think I wanted to just put this forward as this concept that you can actually do real-time monitoring, and that, ideally more and more systems would be doing this, because then we could actually test the likelihood that a system has bias in it. So I'll just pause there and see if you guys have any further questions. Nope. Okay.
Quite an important point, right? That Frida is making here, in that many providers would say we're not testing. We can't test, it's too complicated. I mean, they won't literally say we want tests to not be legally liable. They're not saying that, but they're saying, well, it's too complex, and we don't quite know, and we have tried, and etc. But because if you find something, you have to report and you have to do something. So in many cases, it is legally less risky not knowing.
Yeah.
And I know, you have some experience. Did you want to jump in, John?
Oh.
No, you're good. Okay. So that is a very important thing. You're saying that with that trick, I'm calling it a little bit of a trick, right? In that probabilistic.
Exactly.
You're saying probabilistically.
Yeah.
We're saying it increases, the likelihood is increased if we do X, it's decreased if we do Y. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep. That's a great way of putting
Kelly.
it.
I have a question that goes a little bit farther back to the beginning. Can you hear me okay?
Kelly, I'm going to give you the mic.
I don't think I can hear you.
I'm just going, I have a question that goes back
Sure.
a little bit towards the beginning
Yep.
about the 4/5 rule and the example you gave. And I wondered how that rule could apply to intersectionality and less binary categories if it's being applied broadly. Yeah.
That's a great question. And I think right now, so let me go to UGAS for the Uniform Guidelines for Employment Selection Procedures. Right now, these basically, think of this as an instruction manual for how you should think about testing. Okay. Now, back in the day when these were set up, which was in the late 60s, early 70s, AI wasn't a thing. The internet wasn't a thing. People were talking about basically paper and pencil tests like the SAT, basically, right? The reason I bring that up is because the guidelines have been, they're sort of like they're an instruction manual for how you should test these things. 50 years ago, people weren't thinking about intersectionality and other things, and sort of non-categories. So right now, the way these instruction manuals have been used across employers, in the US and then other countries as well, is to just look at gender and race individually. I don't know of any employer that's currently doing intersectional analyses. That's not to say that wouldn't come down the pike, but right now that isn't something that I've seen folks do. And again, that may change, and I think that's kind of the bleeding edge, and certainly would be good to look at. But right now, that's not something that we've seen kind of like anyone do at the moment.
I presume, Frida, in theory, right? I'm just saying in theory, pymetrics could do this, or a tool like pymetrics could do it, but gets much more complicated, right? We can already see, right? The sample size gets much smaller. It just gets much harder.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that we always have to balance out, to your point, Iris, like, again, this is just showing that even with a perfectly fair model, you will get the likelihood of finding disparate impact is actually quite high when you have very small samples, just because that's the way the math works. And so therefore, I think they're always trading off, like, the problem of small sample sizes and whatnot, and getting real results, with the idea that, we always want to do more, and we always want to look at, more categories, wherever possible. So let me just talk to you a little bit about some new laws that have come into effect, because I think that one of the things I want to sort of emphasize with this group is that, the uniform guidelines, again, have been in place for about 50 years. And so the first thing that the uniform guideline says is you should avoid disparate impact. So based on that, you might think disparate impact is illegal, meaning anything that has bias in it is illegal. Unfortunately, that's not true because of point number 2, which is this loophole that was created that says, well, if you find disparate impact, that's okay, so long as you can show that it predicts job performance. Now, in certain cases, that makes perfect sense, because let's say you're a moving company and you need people to move heavy objects to do the job properly. Okay, well, that makes sense. And let's say that men are more likely to be able to move. Let's say you take 100 men and 100 women, and only 10 men can lift heavy objects, but only 5 women. So you'd say, okay, I get it. In this case, moving heavy objects, you can't move a piano without that. I get it. There's going to be disparate impact against women, right? And that's why they left it in there, for these sort of, supposedly infrequent occurrences where, groups would be disadvantaged, but in a way that was really important for doing the job well. And they also said, but even if that's the case, you should have documented that you looked for the least biased alternative. In reality, unfortunately, that is not what has happened. And I'm just going to pull up this chart, because it basically shows you that the vast majority of traditional tools have disparate impact. This is basically selection rates for African Americans and for Latinos against whites or Caucasians. And as you can see, basically every one of these tools has disparate impact. And so you might ask, well, why is that? Why is it you might ask, why is it that they have disparate impact? And then the second question is, like, why are they still legal? The reason that why they have disparate impact is because a lot of things in life create disparate impact. If you look at GPA, that causes disparate impact. If you look at college degrees, that causes disparate impact. Many things that are sort of mere societal privilege, I guess, for lack of a better word, tend to cause, in particular, racial disparate impact. And so it's actually quite hard, if you look at more traditional types of data, or if you use more traditional tools, to find something that doesn't have disparate impact. So the reason I'm putting up this slide is because a lot of times I'll have these conversations and people will say, well, disparate impact's illegal. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's perfectly legal. And the reason that these tools remain legal is because they've been shown by these meta-analytic studies to predict job performance. But the problem is, it's sort of a circular reasoning, right? Because if the people I pick are largely Caucasian or largely male, and then I then show that they predict job performance, then it's a vicious cycle, right? Because then, that you're never sort of introducing new data into that equation. And maybe, women or people of color could do the job just as well, but you're not actually introducing them into the sample in any size. So I think we really have to just sit back for a second and think, okay, is this how we want the world to remain? Or do we want to look at other types of data that could be much better at allowing less or more diverse, folks into the picture? And that's sort of what we have attempted to do. Now, what surprised me when I started pymetrics was realizing that this situation was as bad as it is. So 50% of companies use cognitive ability tests, 50, so half. So you can imagine the impact that this is going to have on diversity if you're using a test that looks like this. And these tests are also in widespread use. So why do these tools remain when our system 2 thinking is saying, no, I want to have a more diverse workforce? And there's still a lot of reasons for that. There's a lack of awareness. So again, if you are a vendor that has disparate impact, you don't advertise this on your website. You sort of talk about how you're how you're, predict performance and all the rest of it. And somewhere in the depths of your technical manual, you have something that looks like this, but not everybody's looking at your technical manual and everyone's looking at kind of the marketing on your website. And there's also just a lack of standardization, right? A lot of people use things like debiased or fairness optimized or, and so, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of ethics washing in the field. And many other reasons. So I think that there are lawmakers, that have become a little frustrated with the situation to say, look, it's fine and dandy that, in certain cases, disparate impact should be okay if it's absolutely necessary for a job, like moving heavy objects in the moving company example. But for the vast majority of these, situations, maybe it's just a correlation with job performance. And maybe if you actually had a more diverse set of people doing the job, you'd find different outcomes. And so New York City was actually first of its kind in passing a law this year, end of last year, that will come into effect January of 2023. That's actually going to require that employers in New York City publicly disclose information about bias in their hiring tools. This is going to be first of its kind. And as you can imagine, it's going to be pretty important in helping employers and candidates and sort of the public at large evaluate different tools. Like if an employer had to basically put a chart that looked like this on its website and say, oh, by the way, I use this tool over here, not this tool over here, they might be subject to more questioning as to like, why are you using a tool that still has a lot of bias as opposed to selecting something that is less biased? And this isn't just the only law, this is actual law. There are lots of other bills that are sort of undergoing in other municipalities and state jurisdictions. And I think it's important to note that I think that, EEOC and sort of federal agencies have done a great job in sort of laying the groundwork. But I think enforcement of UGASP is still lacking because a lot of this data is still hidden or obfuscated. I wouldn't say it's hidden, but it's obfuscated from the public. And I think until we get to a place where there's a lot more public reporting on the amount of bias that's present in a lot of these tools, we're always going to be in the situation of sort of scratching our heads and being like, why doesn't the workforce look more diverse? It's not hard to understand why the workforce doesn't look more diverse when you see a graph like this. So I think we only have a few minutes left, but I will get off my soapbox and pause there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to Peter, who I called John before.
Sure.
John normally sits there. I apologize, Peter.
This is great. I want to ask you about your work in terms of maybe as an expert witness. Have you been utilized as an expert witness, and what side, management side or the other side, what side really is utilizing, and what in terms of the enforcement space, right? How is an enforcement bar utilizing this type of information in terms of the possible litigation, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think so my perspective is, I guess I tend to believe that human beings will do the right thing when they're given the tools to do the right thing, right? And I personally believe that a big part of the problem right now is a complete lack of awareness of how not great the situation is, okay? And maybe that's just because I'm an optimist and I don't even know. But I think that like the first thing that, laws like this will encourage is people actually looking very carefully at the data once they know that they have to, publicly report on it. And I think that will go hopefully a fair amount of the way towards reducing over reliance on tools that are just, and again, a lot of these tools are just old. They're old and antiquated. It's not that, they just need updating basically, right? So if that obviously doesn't work, then obviously there are other mechanisms, right, around enforcement. And, maybe that's where this has to go, is that, folks that continue to rely on tools that are, showing a lot of bias and are not moving towards tools that are less biased, maybe there does need to be some enforcement action. And again, I'm not a lawyer, and that's not my area of expertise, but I can imagine that, there are people who are looking at this and saying, if this doesn't sort of change, behavior, sort of voluntarily, then yes, of course, that would be, I think, kind of the next course of action. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not the best person to answer that, but obviously it would be helpful, I think, in terms of understanding, sort of where the problems still lie.
Wait, I'm going to next turn to you, right? Because you are our official person starting us off with the question. So please.
Hi, Frida. Thank you so much. This was very interesting, and actually going through your profile and the work of AI, it's very new to me. It was very interesting. I just have a couple of questions.
Sure.
I read that some people believe that using AI is not really helping companies diversifying in terms of knowing exactly what kind of new skills they would like to introduce or they need to introduce in the jobs, because they base the selection on the data they get from the companies.
Yep.
So they end up having almost the same people, same type of skills and
Right.
everything.
Yep.
And this would make me ask you, do you think there will be new versions of the AI in terms of helping companies diversifying and getting to know what type of new skills they need, not only in terms of gender and ethnic groups, but more the skills?
Yep.
And
Yeah.
the other question is that this is the last one. But I understood that your company is really involving the customers who are the employers in terms of deciding on the games and the questions the prospective employees will be asked. But do you involve the employees themselves? Did you ever get to hear what they think about the product? Did it help them open new doors for them or not?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. So I'll try to answer in the order you asked. So whenever I hear criticisms of AI, I think to myself, well, what's the contrast? How are humans doing it, right? Because again, you can only really compare artificial intelligence against what would otherwise be used. And so I think that you're absolutely right in saying that both artificial intelligence and human processes are very susceptible to anchoring on skills of the past. It's not just an AI problem, right? It is basically just that, like, when we look to hire somebody, generally speaking, we look within our company and say, what has been successful previously, and look for that, as opposed to saying, hey, what do I need for the future, and look for that. Now, again, that's not all companies. And I think companies more and more are looking to sort of, bring in new skills and all the rest of it. And I actually think that, again, a dynamic system like an artificial intelligence system can really help with that, much more so than a human process. And again, it's not an either or. So by the way, I guess I should mention this. Pymetrics doesn't replace humans. It helps them, right? The place where pymetrics sits is before a human has ever met a human. So the same way you would drop a resume, you would also go through pymetrics, and then that data would be decided, would help decide like who comes in for an interview, what role are you interviewing for, and so on. So we perfectly believe that humans plus machines are the best solution. But all I'm saying is that I don't think AI, I think AI actually, and again, my biggest concern with AI really is about bias. It's not about sort of the fact that it can't sort of index on new skills and whatnot. I think it absolutely can do that. I think the biggest concern I have is it propagating human biases as much as humans have. So hopefully that answers that question. And then yes, we do have, we call it a product advisory council, but essentially it's people who have been through pymetrics, who have, and I think it's like 30,000 people that we sample, and we say, look, would you like to give us feedback? And they can give us feedback in a variety of different ways. We've interacted with them. We continue to interact with them throughout the build of our product to ensure that it's working as well as it possibly can for them.